Welcome back to the show for caregivers, about caregivers, hosted by a caregiver. This is Hope for the Caregiver. I am Peter Rosenberger, and I'm glad you're with us. I'm joined in the studio today by my longtime friend and pastor of 19 years. 19 years, John.
Showing your age there, buddy.
Showing his age.
I haven't made much progress yet either.
We're working on it.
You teed that up.
Yeah, I was going to say, we got a live one here. Buddy.
You should see what he gives me most of the time.
There's
I will say,
chords.
No. I did do this 2 weeks ago. He put in a hymn that had a great text. Great text.
Okay.
But it was a hard text. It was a very meaty text.
Mm-hmm. Blame it on the music director.
And so I told him before the service, I said, really? Could you pick out something that had a little bit more enthusiasm in it? And then I wrote on the back of a sheet of paper, wifey, I wrote a 6.1 and held it up so only he could see it from the piano after the song was finished. So I did that right after the congregation sang that. So
we hadn't even started the service, and he had already been critical.
Worse than the Russian judge.
Well, this is my pastor, Jim Bachmann, and Jim from Nashville, originally from. I guess were you born here?
I was.
Yeah,
Baptist Hospital.
Really? No kid. Well,
it used to be Baptist
My
Hospital.
sons were born there. Originally from here, and then he went off to seminary in and then you went to Chattanooga. Was your first church?
Lookout Mountain Presbyterian Church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then you came back here, built an amazing church, and now you're building a second church. I mean, you've been doing this for 38 years.
Be 39 next month,
and half of them.
And I've lost most of my hair.
Half of them have been with me.
I hate to do this. You may have started on my birthday.
What was your birthday?
In June of 81.
I was ordained June 15, 1980.
June 19th.
I graduated high school in June of 81.
Sorry, guys.
Thank you for that, John. Thank you.
I wasn't. I've been doing this for a lifetime. I'm talking about him.
You have literally been doing this for his lifetime.
This is a decent amount of experience in the room, so I'm listening.
A decent amount is a great word. Yeah. And I wrote an article recently, and it got a little bit of traction out there in the media world. And I stole the title from you. I mean, you gave me the title. I stole it. I didn't give you credit.
I hope it was a good one.
But it was The Lost Office of Pastor. And you gave me that title. And we've talked about this a lot because one of the things I do on my show here, and for those of you just listening, on the show for caregivers, caregivers are notoriously overlooked, unchurched, unengaged, and everybody asks about your loved one. But what about you? Are you in a place where you're the only one on the pew that's not singing Victory in Jesus kind of thing? Because that's what happens. A lot of caregivers, we get kind of, we don't know how to respond. And you've been very instrumental in me and engaging me as a pianist, as a church member, just as a friend, as a brother, as a congregant, all of those things. And I want to export that as much as possible. But when I started writing about The Lost Office of Pastor, and you and I talked about this, a lot of pastors, all pastors preach, but not all preachers pastor. Talk about that a little bit.
I think that's a fair statement. Pastoring is hard.
Messy?
It's messy. It's going where the pain is, where the suffering is, where the dying is. And let me qualify this by saying that there are many wonderful preachers and pastors out there who do both and do them very well. But I think it's fair to say that there's a tendency among maybe the younger generation especially to so exalt the office of preaching or the calling of preaching that that messy work gets overlooked. I think we're sinners like everybody else, and we have egos like everybody else, and we like to build. You mentioned a beautiful building earlier. We like to do those things. We like to have big crowds. We like to be known as a great preacher. That's very public. That's very visible. And we tend to get a lot of great sermon preachers. That was a 10 today, attaboy, that sort of thing. But that one-on-one ministry of going to the hospital or the nursing home or being where someone is in pain is much less glorious, much less noticeable, and yet so very important. Because, remember this, people don't really care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah, and the great sermons can easily be forgotten in lieu of a slight when the suffering hits.
I think the sermons are better if the congregation knows it's coming from a pastor who knows them, preferably who knows them by name, no matter how large the church is. I think most people want a relationship with their pastor, senior pastor. Obviously, sometimes you're in a very large church and there's only so much a man can do, and you have a multiple staff and they specialize in certain areas. And I've been in one such church myself. But even in that case, I always felt like most people wanted to know me. And truthfully, I wanted to know them too, so it came fairly naturally for me. But it's awfully easy, I think, for some pastors just to specialize at the expense of really knowing their people and shepherding their people. Jesus described himself as a good shepherd.
Well, the word pastor comes from the Latin word pastor, which means to shepherd.
That's right.
And you've been there with me in hospital rooms. You've been there with me in dark times, and with Gracie, both of us, my whole family. And my dad's a minister. My dad's been a pastor for 60 years. I've watched how the job is done. Pastors are the ones that get the ugly calls in the middle of the night.
That's correct.
And you and I've had the privilege as a pianist. I've done this a lot with Dad. I was free labor to him growing up because when your dad's the pastor and you're a pianist, you get you get drafted. And but I don't play weddings. I refuse now to play weddings anymore. I truly do not like doing them. But I will try to make an effort to play every funeral that I can, because I think that's an opportunity to really minister to people. And you and I have done, I don't know how many funerals we've done together.
You've been a great asset at the funerals in which we've participated.
But that's where you've talked about is where it really. That's where the role emerges as a pastor. You're not a preacher you're preaching, but you're there as a pastor for these people.
Well, and hopefully you've been there, frankly, walking with people to the finish line.
Yeah. And you've done that, and that's not something that a lot of people are comfortable with these days.
Well, a lot of pastors, and I had a seminary professor one time, apologetics professor, and I don't know if he was in a bad mood this particular day or not, but he had a class of 30, 35 students. Most of us were young. And right in the middle of his lecture, he stopped and he said, "Men, I don't know why you all are going into the ministry, because as I've watched you for." Most of us were second or third year students. He says, as I've watched you for 2 or 3 years, most of you don't like people.
Well,
that raises a serious question. Why are you feeling like God's called you into the ministry if you don't like people? He didn't wait for an answer, but I think he made his point.
Well, I think so too, and I think you have to. If you don't engage people, then you're an inspirational speaker who may be great. I mean, you may be a good speaker and a good teacher, but if you don't engage them, Franklin Graham once said this, and I'll let you respond to this. He's talking about Samaritan's Purse. He said, it's not the kind of ministry you can run from behind the desk. You got to get out and smell it.
Right.
And suffering and affliction has its own smell. It's uncomfortable.
That's a good word. It has its own smell. And I think the fault lies on both sides, in the pulpit and in the pew, particularly in the large churches. I think there are many churches that want their pastor to be a preacher and not a pastor. They want him to be a CEO. They want him to run the church, when frankly most ministers have no training in that whatsoever.
No, they don't.
Our training is in preaching the word, and I remember we had a hospital visitation class in seminary. None of us liked it. And we had to after our visits, we had to make these verbatims. You had to write down exactly what your conversation was with the person, and it was an unusual class, but it really helped us reflect on what we said and how we said it. And these were strangers we were visiting, so it's much easier in a pastoral context where you have a relationship with somebody. But I had a man on my staff one time, a pastor, who told me point blank that for him to go to the hospital was like pulling his fingernails out. And he was a very fine preacher and a very fine teacher and a valuable staff member, but he just didn't like going where the pain was.
And yet that's where ministry happens. I remember, I want you to respond to this. I ran into a guy the other day who was really into apologetics, and for a long time I thought apologetics was just saying I'm sorry a lot, but, which I do a lot. But This guy was he fancied himself kind of a prophet, and he was a big burly fellow, and I met him in a place, and I said, well, what do you do? He said, well, I'm into apologetics, and he's very forceful. And I said, okay, what would you say to someone who is suffering? And he said, and he was a good 6, 7, 8 inches taller than me, big guy. And he said, I'd say God's faithful. And he said, with that kind of enthusiasm. And I looked at him square in the eye, and I said, that must have been very comforting to Uriah's parents.
Ooh.
And it stopped him. Now, for those of you who don't know the story of Uriah and David, King David had Uriah killed so that he can marry Bathsheba, who David had already gotten pregnant. And here this guy, King David, kills Uriah. And so I looked at this guy, and I wasn't trying to be snarky much, John.
I mean,
but the guy was. But when you're talking to people who are suffering, you don't just slam them with apologetics. You've got to be willing to grieve with them, and be tender. And you've had that opportunity to speak into the lives of people who. I mean, you just told me before we came in here that you just made a mental note. Oh yeah, I'm going to go take communion over to one of the members of our church who's basically homebound now. Mm-hmm. And you've got to be. There's got to be a level of humility in it. And that only comes from just doing it.
Well, you've been around a lot of doctors, Peter, and I'm sure you've noticed some have a wonderful bedside manner, and you've probably seen a few that weren't so good in that area, and the same is true in the ministry. I don't think caring is a spiritual gift. I think caring, you're in a caregiving ministry. I think it's a fruit of the Spirit, or it's an outgrowth of the fruit of the Spirit, love and joy and peace and patience and gentleness and kindness and these things. And so pastors, it should be second nature to us. And I realize God does give different gifts to us. And there's a place in God's kingdom and in church leadership for those who are somewhat rough around the edges. I think we all grow. I think younger men tend to struggle with this. I was more uncomfortable as a younger man going to the hospital, but you learn over time that, as I think it was Thoreau said, most people live lives of quiet desperation. There's a lot of suffering. There's a broken heart on every pew, and you just have to care. You don't have to have the right words to say. Sometimes there are no words to say. It's just being there. It's just loving them and loving their families and staying in touch and following up after the funeral. Many times it's for a loved one, for someone who's lost a loved one, there's a certain adrenaline, that suffices through the funeral and a few days afterward. But as the weeks and months roll by and the reality sets in, that's an opportune time for us to show our church members that we really care. We're not just a flash in the pan sort of, I have to care for you today, and once the funeral's over with, I can stop caring and move on to life again. No, it's a
perpetual care.
Yeah, it's perpetual. That's right.
Well, I've watched this with you, and I've learned from you on this, and then I also remember you said something to me. You and another pastor we were off to the side there one time, and I was getting ready to go out and play kind of a prelude time, and you guys said to me, are we pastoring you well? And I thought that was a very humble thing to say to me. And you knew how difficult my life was, particularly at that time. It was a very difficult time. And I said, I'm listening. I'm sitting in the pews, and I'm listening. And you know what I'm carrying. You just keep doing what you're doing, because I'm listening. If what you're saying is not going to be applicable in my life with my challenges, then why would you say it? And of course, yours is, and I've always appreciated that. But I think that sometimes we get so wrapped up in making sure that we have 3 points in a poem in our sermons that we have an inspirational message, but we got to fit.
You're going to meddling now.
I know, but we got people there are people that are bleeding in the pews.
Well, the preaching, I just feel like the preaching is hollow if it's not supplemented or followed up with real caregiving. And on the other hand, if there is real caregiving, if the preaching is delivered in a context of caregiving, it's all the more powerful.
Well said. Well said. This is Hope for the Caregiver. This is my pastor, Jim Bachmann. Stevens Valley Church, StevensValleyChurch.com. If you need a church home and you're floundering around and you don't know where to go. You know what? This is a church that understands that. They've cared for me.
And we're happy to support you, and you are a sermon in shoes.
Well, thank you very much. They've cared for me. They've cared for me for a long time, and I wouldn't be doing this show if it weren't for them. So, StevensValleyChurch.com, Jim Bachmann. Don't go away. We got more to go. This is Hope for the Caregiver. This is Peter Rosenberger. You know what? We're glad you're with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show for caregivers, about caregivers, hosted by a caregiver. I am Peter Rosenberger. Glad to have you with us. I've been joined in the studio today with my pastor, Jim Bachmann, pastor of 19 years. Half of his entire career as a minister has somehow included me. That's kind of.
I had a lot more hair when I started.
Bless his heart,
and for
Look
that
what
we
you've
are
done to
very
me.
sorry.
Bless his heart. Little piece of news here. Gracie was in the studio after her neck injection. And a trip to Waffle House on Friday morning, went to the studio, and she and gospel icon Russ Taff recorded a duet. And Russ says, like, 11 Grammys, 18 or so Dove Awards, and wait till you hear this. And this is, it's really extraordinary. And we'll debut it on here when we get it all finished up. But it was just an amazing time for her to sing with this guy that we grew up listening to. I mean, you know, he's an icon. So, hey, I was noticing we're on Facebook Live. If you ever want to watch the show on Facebook Live, just go out to facebook.com, Hope for the Caregiver. And I was noticing, though, that Moses is watching. Moses, are you still watching? Moses Coho. He is the director, the head of the National Prosthetic and Orthotics Center in Accra, Ghana. We've worked with them for now almost 15 years. And we've been providing legs. What we do is we recycle prosthetic limbs, and they come from all around the country. And, in fact, I was just at Gracie's prosthetist. She got some new legs this week. Mom, Gracie got magic legs. My little lieutenant.
How many times have you been using that joke, man?
My little Lieutenant Dan, she got magic legs. But she got some new legs, which is really amazing. By the way, she's standing up 15 degrees straighter. She's been kind of hunched over because of the way her back is messed up a little bit, and we're trying to get her straight up. And now they've got to be able to. She's able to stand up about 15 degrees straighter. Oh. She's working these out.
Way to go, Gracie!
And it's very cool, and they're great legs. But while we're there, the prosthetist there handed me a donated above knee leg, which is still in the car. I got to take it over to the prison. Core Civic has one of their faith-based program with the inmates is these inmates volunteer to disassemble a used prosthetic limb. You were around when we started this thing.
I was, yes.
You've helped us birth two unique and multinational ministry, because this show now goes into Canada. In fact, I want to give a big shout out to John's fan base up in Prince Edward Island.
I thought it was Nova Scotia.
No, it's PEI for those of us in the know.
That's right.
And to the bakers up there, so I want to give a big shout out. She always
John,
thank you.
John, give the bakers a shout out. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, guys.
but you, Jim, you helped us launch two multinational and unique ministries. We were the first evangelical prosthetic limb outreach in the world, and this is the nation's largest radio program for caregivers in the world. Well, how about that?
My part was very small, Peter. You had the vision, you had the energy, you took the trips.
and by the way, you're going with me on the next one.
Okay,
we're going to take you over to Ghana, but Moses is watching, and he is Moses. I'm going to call you out on the air. I need you to get that resin tomorrow. I sent him over some money to buy the resin. So get the resin. We buy some things in Ghana. We're trying to ship a large supply of resin over there, but it's going to be about $8,500 to do that for a 55-gallon drum. It's cheaper to buy it in big quantities, but it's very expensive to ship. And we buy it gallon at a time as we need it in Ghana. We can get it there, but it's really expensive. So we're trying to raise the money to get a big shipment of it to go over there, because that'll make about 350 legs. And then I got to take these legs and materials in my car over to the prison so these inmates can strip them down and they reuse them. And all this is going on, and it's a great work. We put legs on folks. Gracie wanted to reach out to her fellow amputees with a tangible way of sharing the gospel. And that's what we do at standingwithhope.com, which is the presenting sponsor of all that we do here with the show, with everything. and it's for the wounded and those who care for them. And I thought you guys would like to meet the guy that helped me launch all of it, and that's my pastor who's right here. And he'll be bashful. He won't take any credit for it, but he deserves a lot of credit because there's been a strong hand on our shoulders throughout this journey at standingwithhope.com. And, that's what pastors do. They see the sorrow and the heartache. They come alongside them, and then they point them to the great hope of the gospel. And once that happens, man, Katie barred the door because amazing things can happen. Who would have thought a woman with all the things that Gracie's gone through, and yet here we are, and hundreds are walking in Ghana because of her. And now this show, which is taken off. So, Jim, thanks for being here.
God bless you, my friend. Keep up the good work.
Listen, we got to go. Standingwithhope.com. If you want to be a part of this, we'd welcome it today. Help us put some resin together and send it over there and get them walking and leaping and praising God. Standingwithhope.com. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much.